He walked into the courtroom in 1970 wearing a white jumpsuit no one expected outside a stage. The judge sneered, calling it a circus costume. Everyone braced for Elvis Presley to lash out, but instead of anger, what he did next left the entire room holding its breath. Las Vegas, March 1970. The municipal courthouse sat in a plain stone building, just blocks away from the neon lights of the Strip. Inside, the air was heavy with cigarette smoke and whispers. Around 60 spectators filled the benches. Reporters crouched over typewriters, waiting to capture any headline. At exactly 9 a.m., the doors swung open. Elvis Presley stepped inside. He wasn't in a grey suit, like most men facing the bench. Instead, he wore a white stage jumpsuit studded with rhinestones, its cape brushing against the floor. Light from the high windows struck the sequins, sending flashes across the walls. The room gasped as one. This wasn't a concert. This was a courtroom. And yet, here was the king of rock and roll dressed for the stage. Some smiled in disbelief, others shook their heads. One reporter whispered, "Does he think this is the Hilton?" The case itself was minor, a dispute involving a hotel contract. But in that instant, the case no longer mattered. What mattered was the image. Elvis Presley, larger than life, refusing to shrink into the shadows of protocol. Judge Harold Brenner, a stern man in his 50s, leaned forward at the sight. His lips tightened. He tapped the gavel once, and the crack echoed. The crowd hushed. The judge's eyes narrowed as if he had already made up his mind about the man standing before him. Elvis did not bow his head. He stood tall, scanning the room with quiet calm. He caught the eye of a young court clerk who froze mid-step, stunned at being noticed by him. To some, it looked like arrogance. To others, it was defiance. But to a few, it felt like something else. A man walking into judgment exactly as he was, refusing to disguise his true self. The tension in the air grew. Every camera clicked. Every pen scratched against paper. The crowd became a single restless body, leaning forward, waiting to see how this spectacle would unfold. Was this courage, or was it foolish pride? Elvis shifted slightly, adjusting the collar of his suit. The rhinestones glimmered again, blinding a photographer who cursed under his breath. A woman in the back clutched her ticket stub from his show the night before, as if it were proof that this moment was real. The courtroom was supposed to be a place of law and order, not showmanship. Yet here spectacle had become law. Every eye was locked on the man who refused to blend in. Some wondered, if you were mocked before a judge, how would you defend yourself? With silence, with anger, or with something else entirely? Judge Brenner cleared his throat. The sound sliced through the air. He tapped the gavel again, slower this time, as if daring Elvis to break the rules of this chamber. The crowd's whispers turned sharp. "He'll regret this," one man muttered. "The judge won't let this pass." And then the judge leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain. The silence before his words was unbearable. Would Elvis finally be humiliated in front of them all? Judge Harold Brenner's voice cracked across the room like a whip. "This is a courtroom, Mr. Presley," he said, his tone heavy with sarcasm. "Not a carnival. That outfit might suit a circus, but it has no place here." The words stung the air. A ripple of laughter stirred among a few reporters in the back, their typewriter keys pausing just long enough to savor the moment. One chuckle turned into another, and soon a low murmur of amusement spread through the benches. Elvis didn't move. He stood as still as a statue, his cape trailing at his heels. The rhinestones across his chest caught the light like tiny stars, as if daring anyone to look away. But the weight of the mockery pressed down, threatening to break the balance of respect in the room. For years, he had been mocked by critics, too flashy, too wild, too unfit to last. But never before had the ridicule been hurled inside a courtroom with the authority of a judge behind it. The crowd waited, breathless, to see what he would do. Would he lash out? Would he storm away? Or would the king of rock and roll be reduced to silence? The sound of pencils scratching grew louder as every reporter rushed to capture the insult. They smelled blood, the kind of headline that would travel faster than any verdict. Elvis's lawyer shifted nervously beside him, whispering something under his breath, urging restraint. But Elvis kept his gaze forward, steady on the bench, as though weighing every choice in that single heartbeat. The judge leaned back in his chair, smirking, certain he had won control of the room. His gavel hovered above the block, waiting to slam down should Presley dare to speak out of turn. And then Elvis's lips parted. The first sound was not defense, not argument, but music. A single baritone note rolled through the chamber, low and steady, almost like a prayer. Gasps filled the benches. A woman clapped her hand over her mouth. One reporter dropped his pencil. It was "Peace in the Valley," a hymn Elvis's mother had taught him when he was a boy in Tupelo. His voice filled the courtroom, rich and unshaken, each word echoing against the high ceilings. The judge froze. His smirk vanished. Nobody had expected this. The crowd leaned forward as one body. The laughter was gone, swallowed whole by the force of the voice that had once silenced arenas of 20,000. Here, in a room of 60, it was even more overwhelming. The hymn carried memories with it. For some, it was Sunday mornings and wooden pews. For others, it was soldiers far from home, listening to Presley sing overseas. And for a few, it was a reminder that even kings could bend to something greater than themselves. The bailiff shifted uneasily, unsure if he should step forward or stand back. Elvis's lawyer sat stunned, his mouth half open, hands resting useless on the table. What was at stake here wasn't just a contract. It was Elvis Presley's dignity. Would he be remembered as a man mocked in court, or as an artist who turned ridicule into reverence? Each note carried risk. Every bar of the song dared the judge to silence him. If Brenner struck his gavel now, it would echo louder than any verdict. And yet, the gavel never fell. Elvis sang on, the final words fading into silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Not a breath, not a whisper, not a pen. The entire courtroom seemed frozen in time, suspended between ridicule and revelation. The silence was deafening. And then, the final note of "Peace in the Valley" hung in the air like incense, slow to fade. The walls of the courtroom seemed to absorb it, and for a long stretch of seconds, the silence was unbearable. No one shifted. No one dared breathe too loudly. It was as if the whole room had been turned to stone. Elvis stood steady, eyes lowered, cape draped at his heels. He didn't smile, didn't bow, didn't even acknowledge the stunned audience. He simply let the hymn speak for him. A camera clicked, then another. Reporters had recovered from their shock, rushing to capture what they knew was no ordinary moment. Their pencils flew across yellow notepads, writing history line by line. Yet even their usual chatter was muted, as though they too felt the weight of the song that had just been sung. The judge's face had changed. The smirk from moments before was gone, replaced by a tight, unreadable stillness. His gavel rested against the wood, but he didn't lift it. His eyes stayed fixed on Presley, studying him as if unsure whether he had just been challenged or forgiven. The stakes had shifted. The case on the docket, a small dispute over hotel contracts and performance clauses, was irrelevant now. Everyone in that chamber knew it. What mattered was dignity, respect, the balance between a man in a robe and a man in a cape. Which one would define this story? And behind it all, another question lingered. What would it cost Elvis? The courtroom wasn't Vegas, where fans screamed no matter what he wore. It wasn't Memphis, where his roots guaranteed loyalty. Here, one man with a gavel could strip him down with a single word. Would the judge see him as a clown in rhinestones, or as the voice that had comforted millions? A cough broke the silence. The bailiff shifted on his feet, visibly torn between duty and awe. Should he interrupt? Should he treat the song as contempt of court? His hand hovered at his side, but he didn't move forward. In the benches, a woman clutched a folded program from a Hilton show, tears in her eyes. To her, this wasn't rebellion. This was faith poured into a song. She whispered to the man beside her, "It's his mother's hymn." The words rippled, carried from mouth to mouth, and soon others nodded. Many had known of Gladys Presley, the quiet force behind the boy from Tupelo. They remembered the stories of how she taught him gospel before he ever touched a microphone. In that moment, Elvis wasn't the king of rock and roll. He was just a son singing the words his mother once whispered in their small Mississippi kitchen. That realization pulled the crowd in closer. Shoulders leaned forward, eyes softened. A man who had been ready to laugh minutes earlier now bowed his head, ashamed. The stakes grew heavier with each heartbeat. This wasn't about whether Elvis would lose the case. It was about whether his dignity would survive. Every spectator knew they were witnessing a turning point. If the judge chose humiliation, this story would spread like wildfire. The king mocked, silenced in court. But if the judge let the moment breathe, the tale would be retold with reverence, and still, the question remained, which way would it fall? Elvis finally lifted his head. His gaze swept the room, not defiant, not pleading, but calm. His deep eyes met those of the judge, unblinking. For the first time, Judge Brenner faltered. He shifted in his chair, adjusting his robe as though trying to hide discomfort. It wasn't just a man in a costume before him anymore. It was a living legend standing in his courtroom, unarmed, except for his voice. The crowd knew it too. They had become a character themselves, a chorus holding its breath, waiting for the next act. Would the gavel strike? Would the hymn be condemned as mockery or honored as grace? The pressure grew unbearable. The reporters scratched feverishly, but their sentences trailed off. How do you describe a moment like this without reducing it to ink? One man muttered under his breath, "This isn't a trial anymore. It's something else." He was right. It was no longer law. It was theater, prayer, and confrontation all at once. Elvis adjusted his stance, folding his hands in front of him. The hymn had ended, but its echo still lived in the bones of the room. And in that silence, dignity itself seemed to stand trial. Would you have stayed silent under mockery, or would you have risked everything to answer with song? The crowd leaned even closer, waiting for someone, anyone, to break the unbearable quiet. And then, a single sound cut through the stillness. The scrape of a wooden bench as someone began to rise. The scrape of the bench jolted the courtroom. A young hotel worker, seated in the gallery, had risen halfway before quickly sitting back down, ashamed of the sound he'd made. His eyes were wet. The silence deepened again, even heavier now, as if the walls themselves were listening. Elvis took a breath. His voice, when it came, was not the booming baritone that had filled stadiums. It was soft, almost fragile. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I came here as myself. This is who I am." The words hung there, simple and unadorned. No defense, no anger, no sarcasm, just honesty. The crowd shifted uneasily, unsure how to react. They had braced for defiance. They had expected pride or fury. Instead, what they received was humility. It wasn't the kind of statement that won lawsuits, but it was the kind that pierced through laughter and cut to the heart. Judge Brenner blinked, his mouth half open. The mocking words he had prepared no longer seemed useful. The robe across his shoulders felt heavier than before. For the first time that morning, his authority seemed to tremble. Elvis lowered his gaze, folding his hands in front of him. He wasn't challenging the court. He wasn't fighting the insult. He was offering something harder. Grace. The tension cracked. A murmur rose from the benches, a wave of whispers. Some leaned back, stunned at the reversal. Others leaned forward, hungry for more. The energy in the room had shifted. It was no longer judge against performer, power against fame. It was something more fragile. Human against human. Pride against humility. And humility was winning. The judge looked away, tapping the gavel once, as though to remind himself of his role. But the strike was weak, almost hesitant. The sound didn't silence the crowd this time. Elvis lifted his head again. His eyes, heavy but kind, swept the benches. "My mother taught me those words," he added softly. "She told me no matter where I stand, never be ashamed to sing them." The crowd broke. A woman in the back sobbed openly. The hotel worker buried his face in his hands, unable to hold back tears. Even the reporters, hardened by years of chasing scandal, hesitated before writing their next line. What headline could capture this without cheapening it? The judge's jaw tightened. He had begun the morning by mocking Presley as a clown in rhinestones. Yet now, in this quiet surrender, he was forced to see a different man, a son honoring his mother, an artist unafraid of ridicule. What happens when compassion answers mockery? For a few seconds, no one knew what to do. The law offered no script for this. There was no precedent for a defendant calming a courtroom with a hymn. Then came the turning point. Judge Brenner lowered his gavel. He did not strike it. He did not condemn. He simply sat back, staring at Elvis with something closer to regret than anger. The sneer that had once curled his lips was gone. The room felt lighter, not free of tension, but different, like a storm that had broken without rain. Elvis nodded faintly, as if to say the moment was enough. He hadn't won a verdict, but he had won something larger, the choice to answer cruelty with kindness. Short bursts cut the silence. He could have fought. He could have raged. He did neither. Instead, he gave grace. The crowd leaned closer, no longer waiting for the judge. They were waiting for each other, caught in the strange communion that had formed. The hotel worker raised his head again, tears streaking his cheeks. His whisper reached only the row beside him. That voice. He sang to my brother in Germany. The words carried, passing from bench to bench, until even those at the back turned to look. And with that, the story took on a life of its own. The whisper moved like fire. He sang to my brother in Germany. A single sentence, spoken by a trembling hotel worker, carried through the benches like gospel. Heads turned, faces softened, and suddenly the courtroom was no longer divided between laughter and judgment. It was bound by memory. Elvis heard it, his eyes lifted slightly, catching the man's gaze. For a heartbeat there was recognition, two lives meeting across a crowded room. Elvis nodded once, almost imperceptibly, but enough for the worker to crumble into tears. The crowd's energy shifted again. It wasn't tension anymore. It wasn't spectacle. It was communion. People leaned closer to one another, whispering fragments of their own memories. A ticket stub from Tupelo, a scarf caught at a concert, a bootleg tape worn thin from replay. Elvis Presley had touched each of them in some way, and now, in this unlikely place, those memories became currency. One reporter set down his pen, realizing that words might fail to capture this. Another photographer lowered his camera, ashamed to intrude on something that felt sacred. Even the bailiff, still unsure if he should step forward, found his hand dropping away from duty. The rules of the courtroom had dissolved. Elvis's voice returned, quiet but steady. "Wherever I stand," he said, "I carry my mother's hymns with me." His words weren't meant for defense. They were an offering. The judge shifted in his chair, visibly shaken. The gavel before him was useless now. No law could command the hearts of those present. For the first time in his career, he was not the center of control. And still, Elvis did not claim victory. He did not boast. He simply stood as a man, rooted in faith, allowing grace to do what argument never could. The transformation was complete. This was not a legal chamber anymore. It was a sanctuary. The walls that had witnessed rulings and verdicts now bore witness to something else. Unity. The crowd became one voice without speaking. The silence was collective, reverent. It wasn't the hush of fear. It was the quiet of recognition, the pause of people who understood they were inside a moment they would never forget. Artifacts clung to their hands like relics. A woman pressed her show ticket against her chest. Another held onto a faded scarf Elvis had once thrown from the Hilton stage. They weren't just objects anymore. They were proof that they had been touched by something greater than fame. And yet, in that moment, the fame didn't matter. Elvis wasn't the king of rock and roll standing trial. He was simply a son, a singer, a man who refused to hide the roots that made him. The reporters, usually quick to twist spectacle into scandal, hesitated. How could they print this without sounding like myth makers? And yet, wasn't that the point? What they had seen felt larger than paper, larger than law. The judge finally lowered his gaze, his gavel untouched. The authority of the room had slipped quietly from his hands into Elvis's song, and though he might never admit it aloud, even he had been silenced not by contempt, but by compassion. What happens when one man refuses to answer insult with anger? When dignity is met with grace? The crowd now had their answer. Decades later, the story would be told again and again, passed down like folklore. But for those inside the courtroom, it wasn't just legend. It was lived truth, and as the moment reached its still point, one thought lingered on every lip. This was no trial anymore. It was history. The case itself ended quietly. The legal dispute was resolved with little fanfare, buried in paperwork and signatures that no one would remember. But the song outlived the verdict. Reporters filed their stories that evening, and though most wrote about contracts and clauses, a few dared to include the strange interruption. One Memphis Gazette headline read, "Elvis Presley silences courtroom with hymn." The clipping survived, folded into scrapbooks, passed among fan clubs like contraband proof of something almost too unbelievable to print. There was no tape recorder running, no official audio. Bootleggers hadn't slipped inside that morning. The moment lived only in memory, and perhaps that was why it grew. Each retelling polished the edges, but the heart remained the same. Mocked by a judge, Elvis answered with song, and the room froze. In Las Vegas fan clubs, the tale was passed down like scripture. "He stood there in rhinestones," one fan would say, "and instead of anger, he gave us a hymn." The word spread to Memphis, then across oceans, whispered among collectors who treated the story as sacred. Artifacts surfaced to anchor it. A woman displayed her Hilton ticket stub from the night before, swearing she had carried it into court as proof she was there. A hotel worker kept a diary page dated March 1970, scribbled with the line, "He sang in court today. I cried." Decades later, that page would be scanned and shared in Elvis newsletters, adding weight to the legend. By the early 1990s, Tupelo honored the memory in stone. A plaque was placed outside the old county courthouse, engraved with a simple phrase, "Dignity is grace under judgment." Locals knew the phrase pointed back to Elvis, though the story was never officially confirmed. Was it myth? Was it memory? For those who had sat in that courtroom, it didn't matter. They knew what they had seen. The ripples continued. At fan conventions, the story was retold between screenings of concert footage. Some called it his finest performance. Not in front of 20,000 at Madison Square Garden, not at the Hilton under flashing lights, but in a courtroom with 60 strangers. No stage, no band, just a voice, and the moral carried weight. Parents told their children, "When you're mocked, remember Elvis. Don't fight with anger, answer with grace." Even Judge Harold Brenner, in his later years, was said to have admitted regret. A clerk recalled hearing him mutter, "He didn't fight me, he humbled me." Whether those words were truly his, or just another layer of legend, no one could say. But they circulated, folded neatly into the story's arc, like gospel truth. Elvis himself rarely spoke of it. Friends said he brushed it aside, telling them, "It wasn't about me, it was about Mama." That quiet dismissal only deepened the myth, because it suggested the humility was real. By the time the story became folklore, Elvis was gone. Yet the courtroom moment lived on, etched in the memories of those who swore they had been there, and in the hearts of those who only wished they had. Some legends are born on grand stages, before seas of fans. Others are born in small rooms, where 60 people hold their breath as one man sings against mockery. This was the latter, and for many, it became proof that even the brightest stars could shine brightest in shadows. And still, one question remained. Was the courtroom silenced because of Elvis's fame, or because of his faith? In the end, the story of that morning was not about law. It was not about contracts or rulings. It was about choice. Elvis Presley could have met mockery with pride. He could have argued, shouted, demanded respect. He could have leaned on his fame to silence the judge. But he didn't. He sang. He humbled himself. He gave grace where anger was expected. That choice changed the room. It turned a courtroom into a sanctuary. It turned laughter into silence. It turned ridicule into reverence. And it turned a fleeting case into a moment remembered for generations. The legacy wasn't in the verdict. It was in the pause after the hymn, when 60 strangers held their breath together and saw dignity made flesh. We ask ourselves, what would we do, standing where he stood, when mocked? Do we fight fire with fire, or do we risk answering with something gentler, something braver? Elvis showed another path. He proved that true strength is not loud, but quiet. It is not in the fist, but in the open hand. The king left that courtroom without fanfare. No cameras followed him down the stone steps. No cheers met him in the street. Yet every person inside carried something with them. A story they would pass on, a reminder that dignity is a choice made in a single moment. Decades later, when fans tell the story, they speak less of sequins and contracts and more of grace. The lesson outlived the man. Perhaps that is why his legend still feels alive. Not because of the music alone, but because of the way he chose to be human. And maybe that's the question for us today. When it's your turn to be mocked, what will you do? If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes dignity matters. Were you ever told about Elvis's courtroom hymn? Leave your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your memory. And if you want more rare stories like this, watch our next documentary-style episode.